Hello Utah students, my name is JC Eklund. I'm back again ready to teach you in lesson number 2. This lesson is titled Biodiversity and Conservation, but here we're going to focus more on threats to biodiversity. So what are the objectives of this lesson? Students should be able to understand the threats to biodiversity. Students will understand how the loss of a species can affect an entire ecosystem. And students will also be able to understand why the current extinction rate is unsustainable. What materials will students need? Just as in the last lesson, students will need a laptop, including internet, paper to write on, a pencil and or pen for notes. To begin, I want to share with you a introductory lesson video as we did last time. This lesson really focuses on the acronym HIPPO, H-I-P-P-O. You will want to remember what those mean, so maybe on your notes through this video, write down what each letter of HIPPO stands for.
Hi, my name is Mary Poffenroth, and I'm an adjunct professor of biology, and today we're going to talk about threats to biodiversity. Now, biodiversity, just so we all have a good working definition, is the differences in life we find around the planet. Now, we all know that we have a lot of environmental problems, and these environmental problems are causing lots of pressure on all the different species around our planet. We can start by using an acronym HIPPO, H-I-P-P-O. Now, this is going to stand for the different threats that biodiversity is currently experiencing. First, H, that stands for habitat loss. Habitat loss is a real big problem. As humans continue to grow and expand, we take up natural native lands for our mini malls and our houses and our schools and our roads. That means that organisms no longer have a place to live. I is for introduced or invasive species. These are species that have come from somewhere else. They haven't evolved naturally in the area that they were put there artificially, usually by us, and they have no natural predators. Many times they can outcompete for resources the organisms that are supposed to be there. Our first P is population. Now, you could probably guess we don't have a population problem with our plants and animals. It's more of a human population problem. As our population continues to skyrocket, we need more resources and more space to accommodate all these billions of people. And when that happens, plants and animals, they're the ones that are going to lose out. Our second P is pollution. Now, pollution is a big problem not just for biodiversity, but for human health as well. We get pollution in the air, in our water, even in our soil. All this pollution comes from the different products we've made and all the artificial chemicals we've created in the lab. Lastly, it's overexploitation. Overexploitation is taking too much from the environment, taking too much fish, or taking too much resources from the land, and this is causing a big problem. Here on the planet, we have finite resources, and these finite resources, there's only so much available. Now, if we continue to take and waste, there's not going to be enough left to go around for the natural organisms living in nature as well as humans. No organism on our planet lives in a vacuum. All organisms depend on one another, including us. So, when we protect biodiversity from the threats to biodiversity, we're not only protecting the plants and animals and fungi and all the organisms out there, we're also ensuring the survival of our own species. Thanks for watching, and if you want to learn more about this subject, click on the link below. Or if you want to learn...
Okay, so hopefully you took notes on what HIPPO stands for, because those are some important threats to biodiversity. If you remember in the last lesson, I had you complete something called the KWL. Here I'm going to have you pause again the video. I'm going to have you take 10 to 15 minutes and think. The topic question at hand is, how could the decline of a single species affect an entire ecosystem? Therefore, a threat to the ecosystem. The K in KWL again stands for no, so I'm going to have you write down what you already know. And the W stands for what you want to know, so write down what you're going to want to know about the threats of biodiversity. And then the L is learned, so at the end of the lesson I'm going to have you return to the sheet and I'm going to have you write what you learned. Simply write it on a piece of paper will suffice. So to begin, we're going to talk about two terms. The first term is background extinction, also just normally known as extinction. And the second term is mass extinction. So what's the difference? Background extinction is when a single, hence keyword there, single, when a single species is eliminated due to one of the hippo causes or examples listed of the hippo causes. And the difference is mass extinction is a rapid decrease in biodiversity across the world. This means that tons of different diverse species has rapidly decreased in population. Generally, some resources say that around 50% or more animals on the planet are eliminated to be considered a mass extinction. So half of the world's population of any and all living things that have been eliminated or the population has decreased would be considered a mass extinction. Okay, so for further understanding, we have a few key terms. The first term I'd like you to understand is called edge effect. What is edge effect? Edge effect is when there's more diversity in an overlapping environment than in two separate environments. So if you remember in the previous lesson, we talked about environment diversity. So we saw images such as water and grassland, where the grassland would meet areas like forest. So if you think about it like that, think of A as the grassland in the image to the right and B as the forest. The population density is actually higher and the diversity is higher in the middle of these two overlapping. So right where the grassland and the forest meet, the diversity is higher than in these two separate entities by themselves. And that's called edge effect. Lower diversity on the outside, higher diversity where they meet. The next term I'd like you to understand is called habitat fragmentation. Habitat fragmentation is simply when you have one habitat, an area, and it fragments, and another word for fragments is like break apart or separate into smaller patches. So you had one habitat and it broke into two or three or more habitats, and that's called habitat fragmentation. The third term I'd like you to remember is called endemic. And so what is an endemic? Well, in our instance, we're talking about an endemic species. An endemic species is defined as a species that is native to where it is found and not found elsewhere. So, say a certain bird is native to Utah, or in my case, Iowa. That bird lives and is native to that state, and it is not found somewhere else. Okay, so the next term I'd like you to learn is called invasive species. Again, invasive species is the eye in the hippo. Here I'm going to have you take a minute to pause the video, and I'm going to have you click. This is actually a link, so you can hover over it and you can click on invasive species. And this is just a short little article I'd like you to read. Okay, so now you're back from reading about what invasive species are. The next term I'd like you to learn is called overexploitation, and it's a threat. This is the threat of overexploitation. What does that mean? Overexploitation is when somebody or a group or organization is harvesting species faster than they can reproduce, which leads to extinctions. If you remember, extinctions can be individual species or mass extinction. Here, they're probably referring more to background extinction or just extinction in general. You have hunting nearly drove bison of the Great Plains and black rhinos of Africa to extinction. At the current rate of logging, all the world's rainforests would be gone in 100 years. Box turtles are collected as pets faster than they are reproduced, and 90% of the world's large predatory fishes have disappeared. This is an example of overexploitation. Say you hunt deer, maybe your family likes to hunt or fish in one area, and they've hunted or fished too often in that area. It could be overexploitation. It could cause the extinction of that species. Here I'm going to have you take a moment to perform an activity. This is the human impact on climate change and threats to biodiversity. So if you remember in one of the hippos, P's, one of the threats to biodiversity is population, and more specifically, human population. So examples of how population and human population can negatively affect biodiversity has to do with how many animals we hunt and eat. That is more referring to overexploitation, the processed food we eat, the housing types, housing materials, the number of people that live in your home. Is your home energy efficient? Does it have any sort of renewability? And by renewability, I mean, does it use solar energy, wind power energy? How much trash do you generate? How far do you travel? So, how much fuel are you using when you travel? Do you carpool? So, if you carpool, you cut down on that fuel usage. And do you fly? So, this is a link to a fun website. It tests your ecological footprint. And what it does is it asks you a series of questions similar to the ones listed on the right here, and it gives you a result. Mine is screenshotted here on the bottom left. So what it's telling me is if everybody in the entire world used the same amount of resources that I'm using, we would need 3.7 Earths in order to be sustainable, which means in order to survive. So if everybody in the world uses as many resources as I did, we would need 3.7 Earths. If you click on the little, once you get done with your ecological footprint, if you click on the little orange icons or hover over the orange icons, it'll tell you different countries and the average amount of Earths that we would need based on each country. I believe the USA is 5. So if every other continent and country of people around the world use the same amount of resources that we did here in the USA, it would take 5 Earths to sustain the world. At the end, if you would like to see, it is important to understand how you can better conserve resources around the world and help lessen the threats to biodiversity. If you hover, why can't I get my ecological footprint within the means of one planet? There's another little orange icon. If you hover over that, it gives you some methods of how you can lessen your threat to biodiversity. So you can pause the video, click that link, and take about 10 minutes to complete the ecological footprint activity. So once you have completed the activity, I'm going to ask, how could the decline of a single species affect an entire ecosystem? So that's something called trophic cascade. Trophic cascade is the addition or removal of a species in a food chain. When you remove or add a species in a food chain, it causes dramatic changes in the ecosystem and a nutritional standpoint, hunting and fishing, for example. Here you can see trophic cascade on the left. So I also want you to take a moment to understand that without wolves, going down the food chain, there'd be a much larger number of elks, and with a much larger number of elks, or deer, I guess, in the image, you'd have less leaves on the trees, because wolves eat elk eat plants. On the other side, if you do have wolves, or one or more wolves, you would have more to consume the food chain of elk, and therefore less eating of plants. So you'd have a more balanced level. You'd have the survival of wolves, elk, and plants, whereas in the first one, if you didn't have wolves, you'd have an overpopulation of elk and could potentially overexploit the plants and potentially cause them to go extinct. So I don't know if you've heard of Yellowstone National Park, but it is where it's one of the world, I think one of the United States' largest national parks. There's Old Faithful and the geysers, but I want you to also take another minute, or well, it'd probably be more like 10 minutes, and click the link provided. This is an article that talks about how Yellowstone National Park had to actually add wolves to their park in order to level out the ecosystem and make it more stable and sustainable, such as the trophic cascade example to the left. Okay, so now I want you to complete a discussion board. Why the question for the discussion board, and it will be posted in Canvas as well, is why is the current extinction rate unsustainable? And to understand why the current extinction rate is unsustainable, I have attached a link at the top, and you can read about the extinction rate. Okay, so let's summarize. What are the main takeaways from this lesson? The main takeaways are the hippo. So we have habitat, invasive species, population, pollution, and overexploitation. And then we have background extinction, which is a single species, mass extinction, which is 50% or more of all species and threat to biodiversity, edge effect, habitat fragmentation, endemic, invasive species overexploitation. You completed the ecological footprint and you read on how you could lessen your threat to biodiversity, and you learned about trophic cascade and how the decline of a single species can affect an entire ecosystem. So I'd like to test your knowledge on the threat on biodiversity and the threats of biodiversity. In Canvas, you will find in the quiz section a short 10-question quiz. After this video is over and you have a complete and full understanding on threats to biodiversity, please take that short untimed quiz. Again, thank you for listening. My name is JC Eklund, and I hope you guys have a great day.